Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the afternoon session of the 2022 Climate Change and Insecurity Project. My name is Tristan Burwell. I'm a research associate for CCIP, and it's a great pleasure to be able to chair panel 3's discussion this afternoon. So for panel 3, what we're looking at is we're looking at building climate security capacity within defence. And to do this, we've got two overarching framing questions that we're going to that our speakers will lead us through. Essentially, we're looking at how education, doctrine, and training can be made applicable to the climate, to factors related to climate insecurity. And we're then also looking at the interventions that defence ministries and militaries can take to both mitigate the causes and symptoms of climate insecurity. So to guide us through, we've got four great speakers. We've got Laurie Laybourn-Langton from Chatham House. We've got Duraid Jalili from King's College London. Brigadier John Clark joins us from the British Army. And we've got also Commander Andrea Cameron coming from the US Navy. I'll introduce each speaker before they talk, and it's going to be Laurie who's going to start us off this afternoon for panel 3. So Laurie is a visiting fellow at Chatham House, as well as the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter and the Institute of Public Policy Research. He's currently leading the Cohort 2040 project, which looks to prepare the next generation of leaders for an environment of great environmental insecurity. Previously, Laurie worked in the UK Health Alliance on climate change. He's also worked at the UK House of Lords, the London School of Economics, as well as the University of Oxford. Laurie, it's a great pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tris. I'm going to share some slides now to guide what I'm saying. Can I do that? It doesn't look like I can. Okay, fine. I will just proceed with some opening thoughts then. So I'm particularly interested here in how we can, I think might be able to, no, I still can't share my slides, guys, sorry. No, that's fine. I'll just talk through what I'm going to say. So I'm interested more in the general situation here of how we're able to deliver the types of transformations that are needed to make sure that we bring environmental destabilization within sustainable limits. We have, and what we can learn in particular from defence and security communities. We have heard over the last couple of weeks from the UN Environment Programme that we have now reached the point where transformational change is required to societies and economic systems. That has been called far before the UN Environment Programme called it by many other people, but now we have the UN itself, based upon its carbon budget and emissions gap work, saying that almost arithmetically now we require transformations to societies. The second point I'm interested in is that has a particular implication for a certain generation. The average age on Earth at the moment is about 31 years old. I understand that that's the average age of many people within an armed force and defence context. It definitely is in the context of the British Armed Forces. They are a generation, if you're 31, who will retire after, quite a while after 2050, when we are supposed to have realised those transformations, where we're supposed to have reached the net zero goal globally and also brought environmental harms to other natural systems within sustainable limits. So their careers are dominated by that huge challenge to transformational change. As we've been hearing in the panels just now, that isn't just a huge lift because, well, transforming societies at that pace and scale is an extraordinary, unprecedented challenge. It's also a hard lift because over that time, we will see the increasingly destabilizing effects of the environmental crisis itself. a lot of the literature from the people who are presenting at this conference and what we've heard on the panels gives us an idea of that increasingly unstable and complex world. To put it crudely, we often talk about the consequences of the environmental crisis leading to physical risks, those that shock societies, discrete risks that shock societies, like increasing heat extremes, storms, and so on, or slow grind impacts like depleting soils. Another risk is so-called transition risk, the risks from the transition itself to firms that, for example, are over leveraged on fossil fuels, or to reputational risks, affecting the customer base of firms or your recruitment as an organization. As we've been hearing so far, there's a third type of risk in this topology. It is those cascading and systemic risks that mean that the shocks that we experienced on the environmental crisis are not isolated to the places where they might immediately emerge or impact, and they reverberate through interconnected systems and multiply other problems. There's a sort of a meta category of risk, I think, that exists above those three that we can think of in terms of concepts like the poly crisis, which we heard about earlier. Those physical, those transition, and those cascading risks will interact with each other, creating a dynamic process of a self-perpetuating momentum of destabilization. So we should think of this less as a new era or a new set of worsening events, but instead a new era of worsening general destabilization, which has impacts for all areas of policy. Now, I think the thrust of many of the inputs we've seen so far in the conference are talking about that kind of new era and the large challenges and costs that come with it. One implication that I'm particularly interested in is then a specific category of risk that results from that more turbulent, we could say, era. And for me, that's a kind of strategic risk to the transition itself, to our capability to maintain focus, attention, and then actually deliver the activities that are needed to ensure that we have a sufficient level of transition, that we bring emissions down, that we repair environmental harms, and ultimately we're able to ensure that societies are sufficiently resilient. So I see this as a kind of a strategic risk to the transition itself, to our transition capability. And there is in a more unstable world, there are destructive feedbacks that could impact that our ability to deliver a transition. We could find ourselves in the extreme, bound up by handling the worsening symptoms of the environmental crisis and ultimately unable to marshal sufficient support or capability to deliver transition. There are also constructive opportunities in moments of dislocation and instability. We know from history there are huge opportunities to drive rapid change. What I'm interested in is how those of that generation, that average age person, 31 years old, who are in influential positions that could be driving the transition, who are in policymaking, who are in businesses, who are in civil society, how they can be better prepared as individuals and as groups to drive that transition and to mitigate this strategic risk to the transition itself. An analogy I often use here is that the way we have often talked about the environmental imperative for decades now is as if we're on a boat, a figurative boat, and on the horizon there is a figurative storm, and the actions needed to drive the transition before you're in that figurative storm require you to persuade people that the storm exists, that we can change the bearing of the ship, and that certain policies and so on are needed to change that bearing. The bearing didn't change enough, and this figurative ship are now in that figurative storm. And the challenge then shifts. You still have to get away from the storm, but your ability to steer is increasingly impacted by being in the storm itself. So I had the great pleasure and privilege of doing a short research project with colleagues at the UK MOD Climate Change and Sustainability Directorate, particularly Matt Ince, who you saw earlier in the conference. And we tried to learn some of the lessons from a defence and security context that could be useful for the challenge facing that generation in driving a transition through worsening instability. Broadly, and we're releasing this soon, we looked at 3 areas where we think there are particular strengths in a defence and security context. The first one are a range of baseline capabilities manifest largely in the lived experience of being within an armed forces and defence context. One that particularly impressed me was the focus on the ability to characterise and storytell in critical action moments, the importance of then setting a certain action trajectory in chaotic moments, and that being utterly crucial, that sort of competition, that battle for effective narratives in those moments of dislocation, instability, and the ability to train for those moments to be better communicators in general, but also to use some of the foresight methods that we've seen to identify narratives that could be effective under certain conditions, I think is particularly important. A second area we looked at was the central requirement to rehearse and the ability to rehearse in an armed forces context. This is something that we don't see enough of, I think, in the wider, more civilian transition policy areas. And I think that the kind of intense situations we're already in and will increasingly see that will face even civilian policymakers will require far more of that situational training and immersion above and beyond the low levels that exist even in more stable times. And then the third is the very focus on mission delivery. And a number of the people we spoke to in the course of research really underlined to me how the ability to maintain an initiative mindset in moments of ferocity, whether that be down right at the tactical level up to the strategic level, is very important. And for me, sometimes the rhetoric around the environmental crisis employed particularly by civilian leaders, particularly political leaders, and indeed people in civil society, is yet, you know, this frame of we can still do this, you know, we can still avoid the worst, we can still. It's only really when we're in the situation where the intensity of a far destabilizing world, we can kick into a different rhetorical gear that's much more about delivering that kind of initiative mindset. In the same way that it was very difficult to talk about mitigating a pandemic before actually being in pandemic conditions. Now, that's highly unsatisfactory, and the work needs to continue to try and limit, of course, the destabilization that's coming down the line, but it will come. And I think in that context, initiative mindset in particular is something that is used in mission situations as a key lesson we can learn from an armed forces context. I will just finish off by saying that we identified, of course, some areas where we think there's more evolution needs to be done in a defence and security context to make sure we're ready for that increasing instability, that more turbulent world. I won't go through them all. The one I will just point to is the one that we've already heard about, which is the need to account for not just worsening physical risks, not just worsening transition risks, and indeed not just worsening cascading risks, but an overall era of turbulence in the assessments that then inform all planning in a defence and security context. And I think based upon what we've heard so far, there's a huge amount that civilian authorities need to pick up, that need to filter out of defence ministries to ensure that that planning is not just done in a defence context, and ways of thinking about a generally more turbulent world and planning and using it as a basis for all planning, the meta object almost of planning, is something that increasingly needs to go into other policy areas as well, or we will increase that strategic risk to the transition itself. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Laurie, thank you. That was absolutely great starter for us to set the context of exactly what our panel is aiming to drive at. So thanks again for joining us, Laurie, and thanks so much for your comments. Coming up next, we've got Duraid Jalili, who is joining us from King's College London. So Duraid's a lecturer in the Department of Security Studies within King's College London, where he delivers education to officers across the MOD's Joint Services Command and Staff Colleges. Alongside teaching, Duraid also serves as the co-director of the King's Environmental Security Research Group, as well as the senior academic advisor for the UK MOD's Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre. Duraid, thanks so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Great to be with you. Thank you. So I'll sort of pick up from where Laurie, Laurie's context, which is that the pace and scale of instability, as you noted, and the strategic risk generated by climate change creates a need for a relatively rapid transition in leadership and capacity development. Now, in response to this, we have seen a wide range of militaries creating and indeed sharing educational content and interventions on this issue. But I would argue that unfortunately, the scale and pace of what is being implemented is currently not aligned with the scale and pace of what is being faced. And I'm just going to cover off two kind of key inhibitors that are influencing this current scenario. The first inhibitor, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that of resources, and particularly the difficulties in prioritizing resources and breaking free of path dependencies. So over the past decade, discussions between educational practitioners across the world in the military environment has highlighted that military personnel are clamoring for more insight on environmental trends, security implications of those trends, and the potential role and capacity of security forces in responding to these issues. So we've seen ad hoc interventions being made in terms of lectures, case studies, elective modules, and so forth, but most personnel and students are not being given the chance to genuinely get to grips with the profound and sort of paradigm changing security implications of these environmental trends, whether that's human, national, international, planetary level issue. And there are two components to this. First is that military personnel, including even those in dedicated educational courses, are not given enough dedicated content and time or space to engage with and reflect on these issues in a sort of sufficiently focused or in-depth manner. And secondly, when military students and personnel do receive content on other security issues, whether that's Ukraine or leadership studies, that content doesn't generally tend to integrate the potential impacts of environmental variables within its conclusions. So there's a disjoint between what students are hearing about in terms of the potential impacts of environmental trends and what they're being told about in terms of the potential future of other security issues. Now, this inhibitor stems from different contexts depending on the individual military force, and you see differences worldwide, but in very broad or generalized terms, in more developed militaries, wealthier militaries, finances are an issue, as with everything, but as a key factor behind this issue is a self-fulfilling path dependencies, as we might call them. So military educators might end up deferring to their existing infrastructures or schedules or pedagogies or lesson plans, as well as their existing Rolodex of experts, because they simply don't have enough time or resource to enact more far-reaching or systemic changes. And these kinds of path-dependent decisions where, the tail ends up wagging the dog can result in a scenario in which critical perspectives or potential solutions are inherently seen as impractical or even naive, in contrast with normative practices and policies. So, rather than being seen as integral norms that should and can be integrated into security thinking. In less wealthy militaries, including those in the global south, those path dependencies do exist and they do influence the content that's delivered and how it's delivered. But obviously, you have a scenario where that's far more exacerbated by a lack of funding and resources. If you're struggling to provide organizational-wide education and training on fundamental warfighting principles, then macro climate security issues are necessarily deprioritized. And, similarly, your government might wish to avoid overt military involvement in adaptation and resilience activities. There may be an absence of official policies on it. And so there exists limited incentive or support for you to develop and drive educational content or solutions. Now, this resource and path dependency challenge can be looked as an opportunity. It can be a common cause. Environmental security could be a common cause around which we drive educational reform, reforms that have been advocated for decades. Similarly, wealthier militaries could take that opportunity to enhance force multiplication, adaptation, dual-use technology, sales, diplomatic networks, etc., by upscaling their investment in international military education, training, concepts, etc. And indeed, as Laura pointed out earlier, integrating and understanding the lessons being learned by other countries and local populations. So that issue, that first issue of resources and path dependencies, is obviously a major factor that we need to reckon with. This leads us to second key inhibitor affecting this misalignment, which is the current deficit of training needs analysis across various different militaries and forces and organizations. So there are a wide range of institutions, experts and scholarship that could be deployed for quick and impactful educational interventions on environmental issues. There are certain military functions in which targeted education could have a disproportionately large impact. You know, if we educate financial or commercial officials, for example, we could enable them to reform procurement in a way that, you know, de facto forces the rest of the defence function to follow suit to a degree. But if we don't invest in training needs analysis, any of those educational interventions run the risk of having a counterproductive impact. So if we increase education for the finance function, that leads to actions that impact on other functions. Well, we need to know how we might prepare those other functions in advance to reduce the adaptation lag time or to avoid gaps in effectiveness. And on a more macro level, there are large swathes of climate skepticism and denialism across defence at all levels of the organisational hierarchy. I'd recommend Motta et al.'s 2021 study on that. And if we don't undertake sufficient training needs analysis, then we run the risk of delivering content that might actively alienate or harden the views of such officials and have a counterproductive impact. So this leads us to two forms of training needs analysis that we need to see across a wide range of security forces. First, the kind of micro level training needs analysis to help gain insight on role-specific inhibitors for understanding or prioritising environmental issues. So finance, capability, you know, infantry roles. And then macro level training needs analysis to help us understand overarching issues such as psychological inhibitors for accepted climate science. You know, where do we focus our resources? What factors could generate a disconnect between knowledge and action? And again, as with the first factor, and I'll finish off now, this is a challenge. It's a major challenge, but it's also an opportunity. In particular, it's a good common cause through which armed forces, governments, academia, etc., can engage in collaboration on enhancing existing training and education systems. That in turn can enhance security preparedness of forces worldwide, as well as things like, you know, task-oriented and trust-based epistemic networks. So, you know, when we look at issues of increasing environmental literacy and preparedness, there are significant challenges in the form of resourcing, path dependencies, and deficits in training needs analysis, but they can also be seen as opportunities for governments and military forces to enhance their education, to enhance force multiplication, to enhance trust-based diplomatic networks, etc., etc. And with that, I shall hand over.
Great, thank you so much. Great, great follow-on from Laurie's opening remarks and setting the context, and great to dive into the educational side of where we need to be going and the current breaks that are on at the moment to potentially prevent us from moving in that direction. We are going to move now to our third speaker. So Brigadier John Clark joins us. So Brigadier John Clark is the Army's head of strategy since February 2021. Brigadier John's commanded at every level up to brigade and has served in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Cyprus and Afghanistan 3 times on operations. Brigadier John, it's great to have you here and thank you for joining us for the conference today. We're very much looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. And I note that there isn't a great deal by way of context that I'll be able to add, I'm sure, beyond some of the preeminent experts we had on this morning. But on the back of Duraid and Laurie's interventions that I thought were very interesting in terms of the sorts of people and the sorts of issues that we need to be grappling with. What I wanted to do was just to share the British Army's perspective on this issue and what we need to be doing about it. I mean, to state the obvious, climate change is a big issue as a key driver of conflict, and I'm sure this morning, I missed the opening session, but I'm sure there was a lot of talk about the environmental impact of forest fires, heat waves, flooding, food and water insecurity, which is very prominent in the news at the moment, and the impact in terms of human displacement and other areas. And what's key to us is the way in which environmental factors are intrinsic to human security, and our role in that as a military I will come on to. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is we tend in the West and in the UK to think this is something that happens over there. And I note, you know, if you look at the fires in the US over the last few years, if you look at the floods in Germany last year, for example, and even the UN World Meteorological Organization's report this morning saying that the rates of global warming, or European warming, I should say, are twice that of the rest of the world. And that has a factor in, you know, in the Army's role as part of defence in our national homeland resilience and so forth. So we're very clear that this issue is something that we need to attend to as an army, as part of defence, as part of government, and in partnership with our allies. Not least because of the attendant impact it has on things like great power competition and extremism. And I think there was conversation in the last panel about the need for a paradigm shift in terms of our understanding of security and prosperity, and I think this conversation plays very pertinently in that area. But I guess for anybody who wasn't tracking the integrated review last year, it was a sort of a prominent feature of that, and beneath that, the Defence Command Paper that may well have been spoken about already. Was all about the point that I make about it. It was an integrated review. It wasn't a defence review or even a defence and security review. It was an integrated review, which is acknowledgement of the fact that our human security, our food security, our energy security, in addition to our sort of traditional military security, are all part of the same conundrum. So we're very, very clear on that. But within the defence element of it, while there is increased focus on important domains such as space, cyber, and obviously in the air and on the sea, it's on land where people live that are most affected by these things. So we think about it deeply and we take it very seriously. But I think my macro point, which I'll return to again in a moment, is that a lot of perspective on this is that, you know, what we do in order to get down to net zero and so forth is out of kilter with our wider purpose of, in our case, fighting and winning wars on land. But I think they are intrinsically linked. As part of our Future Soldier proposition that we announced in November of last year, the widest restructuring of the British Army in several decades, one of the key things that I talk about is to use the medical analogy of prevention rather than cure, about getting out in the world to try and deter adversaries, reassure allies and partners. And what has occurred to me as we talk through this issue is that we can apply the same analogy. So in terms of the prevention of it, we're very clear in our part in supporting the net zero target. And we have a major project within the Army as part of that broader transformation programme called Project Prometheus, which is all about how we make our defence estate more sustainable in order to reduce our emissions, to basically not be part of the problem. And it's a significant piece of work, an investment of about £200 million over 10 years. And just by way of an example, we opened the first site at Leckensfield in September last year at a cost of about £2 million, but with a life expectancy of 25 years, and we judge that it will have paid for itself in terms of the energy that it provides by 2028, with a number of significant follow-on benefits in terms of financial savings, reduced carbon emissions, and obviously making ourselves more sustainable in that regard. So that's one aspect of it in terms of prevention not being part of the problem. The other part, in terms of the implications of this, is that we're very clear of the impact of it on where we might need to operate, going back to my point about geography before, and the environments in which we might need to operate, which speaks to the importance of those sensors in the other domains, in space and cyber and so forth. There's also an impact on what we might need to do, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, which are things that we're well used to doing, in terms, for example, of the relief in Nepal in the wake of the hurricane the earthquake in 2015, in terms of hurricane support in the Caribbean in 2017. But there's also thinking about what more we might need to do in order to protect the biosphere in different parts of the world and so forth. But there's also an impact on how we might need to operate in those sorts of environments. And there's something that we do as an army called Project Mercury, which is predominantly about how we can we talk about the electrification of the battlefield, but the way in which we're able to reduce our logistic burden, to increase the lethality and the sort of self-sufficiency. But there's also a very human impact in terms of performance, so the need for human-machine teaming, for more uncrewed aerial systems and so forth, and also noting that not just in terms of the way in which we need to operate, but in terms of the impact of climate change on the places that are available to hide and so forth. So we think about all of these things quite deeply, and they're reflected in some of the capability development that we're working on. Just specifically in terms of how we take this forward in terms of increasing literacy and strengthening preparedness. First of all, thinking deeply about it. Second of all, working with allies and partners on those areas of geography and where we might need to operate. And I think it was Sharon in one of the earlier panels was talking about that. In terms of capability development, we're working with industry to, for example, work together on how to bring sustainable or decarbonising tech to market, which clearly has a spin-off prosperity benefit. And we've got quite a significant experimentation and innovation program woven into our future soldier transformation. And I know that Paul on the last panel spoke about all of that. But to return to where I started, ultimately the purpose of defence and the purpose of armies within that is to prevent conflict, partly by our core purpose in being ready to fight, and in our case to win wars on land. But we also recognise that we need to play our part in addressing global challenges and meeting wider government targets. But we see our efforts in terms of both addressing the symptoms and the causes of the impact of climate change as complementary to all of those other capability development areas. So we think that all the work that we're doing in terms of that capability development is very much complementary, i.e. it helps to get after some of the problems that are out there in the world and to be part of the cure, but also it enhances our capabilities on the battlefield in terms of being more lethal, sustainable, and so forth. So I'll leave it there. Tristan, back to you.
Brigadier, thank you very much for your words, and thank you again for joining us today. It was great to have you and to hear the British Army's perspective on climate security and the direction forward. We're going to move now to our fourth speaker, who is Commander Andrea Cameron, who joins us from the US Naval War College. So Commander Cameron is a permanent military professor who teaches policy analysis in the National Security Affairs Department and is the founding director of the Climate and Human Studies Security Studies Group. Her academic interests explore non-traditional and transnational security threats and their impact on the US strategic national security and economic interests. Commander Cameron, it's a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan, and thank you for including me on this fantastic panel. So I'm going to take some of the themes that were kind of mentioned, and I'm going to kind of draw it into a very practical, how do we deliver education and training on climate? Some of my thoughts will be conceptual, some are based on my own experience teaching numerous classes in climate and security, and some are based on US policy. But that being said, I'm speaking today on my own behalf and not as representative of the US government. So I think we can all agree that in this ideal world, we would have a climate literate force that, as James Clare stated earlier, would have climate kind of codified in the defense psyche. I really like how he said that. But this may faces many realistic challenges. Anyone who's ever worked in training and education knows how tight this space is for all of the things that we need our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, space guardians to know. And anytime you want to put more in, like for example, climate awareness, you need to start taking something out. And what are those big questions? So it's just such a confined space. And that for that reason, we need to be very, very thoughtful and precision oriented on the type of climate awareness we want to put into the force. So that's a little bit about where the rubber meets the road. It is really important to train at the highest levels. So we give a lot of thought in the US of where to inject the climate training. If you can't do this holistic, all of the force approach, do you target senior officers and civilians and hope that it will roll down the action and the interest? Do you target the junior part of the force who's less resistant to hearing some of the climate messages? Or do you do what Duraid and I do, which is kind of that mid-level career professional, and we start educating them, because for the next 5 to 15 years, as we're really embedding climate into our force, they'll be the future leaders and decision makers. So we really think hard about where's the right level to incorporate climate knowledge. Another way we look at it is career paths, which has kind of been touched on here. Do you want it to be engineering professionals, acquisition professionals, actual operators, so you understand the battle space better? And then once you decide who you're teaching and target that a little bit more specifically, what are you going to teach them? There isn't a lot of climate security specialists, so you tend to pull in climate scientists. But is it the science that they need? Is it the geopolitical impact that they need? Is it the operational impact that they need? So finding out the right pieces of the message for the right audience is really important. And then if we get really sophisticated someday, we can actually start to think about like a 25-year career path. At what points in their career do they need certain pieces of climate knowledge to do their job better? Duraid gave a great description of kind of doing a lot of different training needs analysis, which I agree that the US is kind of in that same place right now. We're really trying to figure out what are the training needs that we need across the force. So I won't go into that into more depth. But I do completely agree that we need the right training at the right time, and that doing this will be critical in developing the climate literacy we need. Within the Department of Defense right now, we have a climate literacy sub-working group at the DoD level, and then the different services are also standing up their own climate literacy groups. But we've come up with kind of two definitions of climate literacy. I will just share the short one with you. Climate literacy means understanding how the climate impacts DoD missions, how DoD operations impact the climate, and then how to make climate-informed decisions. My colleague Sharon Burke mentioned earlier in great detail about all the different decision support tools that were coming out of foresight and wargaming exercises. So I really like to reiterate this climate decision making is the end. Training isn't training just for the purpose of training. We want it to inform the force in a way that in their respective communities and careers, they are taking that because it's their future decision making, which is going to enhance preparedness in the future. Another piece of the challenge is taking this from climate literacy and the discussions I just had, and how do we institutionalize it more? Tristan brought up this panel. It's about training, education, and doctrine. And that's truly where we want this to be someday, that we're not in some ad hoc working group that's figuring out all of these questions, but eventually we get to this endpoint of our doctrine that is embedded with different pieces of climate knowledge and climate awareness, so that it's just incorporated into the thinking of the force. I'll be honest, I think that is probably a couple more years down the road just to get to that point, given that we're at this kind of needs analysis and what is the right types of training that we need at the moment. Finally, I'd like to make one point that I gained out of my own teaching. I teach at the Naval War College, which is a master's degree program about climate and security, and it's about the climate psychology piece. You can't do paradigm shifting education without having a significant moment of pause with your students. And that was something I learned a lot and I've developed a lot. So one thing I have really incorporated into my training is that they get whatever piece of climate knowledge you want them to have, and then corresponding that is the climate problem solving or solutions that are tied to that, so that not only do they see this is the problem and it's huge and it's potentially insurmountable, but that people are working on it and that there are solutions out there and that we need them to apply their knowledge to understanding the problem and future solutions. That can really help that climate doom piece that you hear a lot about in youth. And that's really affecting the younger part of our force at the moment as well. It's also some of the resistance for taking on the climate subject. That is going to wrap up a few of the thoughts that I wanted to kind of augment the discussion with, and I'm standing by for Q&A. Thank you, Tristan.
Well, Andrea, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me. My computer is, I think, on a bit of a lag, but hopefully my voice is coming through, even though I'm showing as muted. Thank you so much, Commander Andrea. That leaves a good chunk of time to fill some questions here, which is fantastic. And we've had a good steady stream of questions coming through from the participants, so thank you for that. And what I'd like to lead with is a question that's been trending at this end, basically focusing on whether is climate change denial a real issue amongst military personnel. And I think we've got I think Duraid looks like he's keen to fill that one initially. So if Duraid, if you want to kick off, and then we can take some questions hear some answers from the other panelists. Thanks, Duraid.
Thanks. I'll jump in because I think I was the one that sort of raised this as an issue within my but so I mean, as the study that I referred to, Motta and Ralston and so forth, Call to Arms for Climate Change, which was published in 2021, which is predominantly amongst the US military, highlights, if you look at the supplementary material of that, you'll see that around 32% of respondents, military respondents, still believe that global heating is mostly due to natural patterns in the Earth's environment. So that's around 32% who believe it's naturally caused, and about 12% believe that average global temperatures aren't rising. So those are quite significant percentages amongst military personnel. I would say from a personal perspective, I've been in a range of, this is not UK specific, but various different policy environments in which senior officials have expressed that they don't specifically believe in, climate change issues, or that they don't believe that, this is a threat, even if they do believe in that. And those go up to the ministerial level. So I think we do have, it's difficult to know how much it's an issue across all military forces, or at different levels of the hierarchy. But at the same point, there is data to demonstrate that it is, certainly statistically an issue. And there are anecdotal experiences to demonstrate that that issue can be at the, at the higher levels of governance, which can obviously impede action being taken. I'll hand over to Andrea, who I know has got some experience in this as well.
Thank you. I tend to agree that you do have a swap. You have people who are all in, those are the people who self-select into my courses, and then you have people that fully deny. The denying part is smaller and smaller based on my experience, and I would say it's more climate avoidance. It is a politically sensitive topic, and if you want your senior leadership to engage on it, you need political leadership to be driving that. And in the United States, that ebbs and flows, whether climate is a priority within our Department of Defense. So with so many missions on the DoD, and you already have your job, and you're not necessarily funded to take on the additional, what does climate mean to my subset of the mission, then you have to think, well, is that the priority of where I want to put my effort? And if you're not rewarded for it, then why would you embark on taking that mantle into the DoD and further institutionalizing it? So those are some of the friction points that we're finding.
Thank you both for those comments. Laurie, I mean, in terms of the risk side that you brought up, I wonder if do you see an overlap between acknowledging the risks and climate deniability in terms of having the risks taken seriously to drive the change that we arguably need within defence? I wonder if there's an overlap into your studies with climate deniability.
I think one of the important things that we can take from a defence and security setting, or at least the purview of defence and security as we've seen it represented here today, is the ability to notice the complex causal chains between the environmental crisis and then the chaotic situations that you see in societies. For me, one of the problems that could grow over time is we get less of the denial of the science, but we get an adaptation first response to the consequences. And I think we already see those strands in politics and civilian leadership. And for me, one of the important things that security and defence communities have got to really help filter out from their analyses and ways of responding is to be very clear on those complex chains that are often, unquantifiable, but are really important to discern in a less stable world. And it's that kind of high resolution on those cascading risks that's going to be really important to make sure civilian leaders cannot drift into what I know has been in the past described as a kind of implicatory denial. And that is in that we could get the adaptation first, almost doom loop, where mitigation is critically crowded out, and then at an aggregate level globally is pushed below a critical threshold needed to, in the extreme, avoid environmental changes that trigger tipping points.
Thanks, Laurie, for that. Brigadier John, I don't know if you have any take on this from the British Army's perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. So my first observation is, and just to clarify, I don't have Duraid's statistical analysis behind this, but this is just some of my thinking and reflections on it. The army or militaries generally are reflective of their societies. So I don't personally think that it's necessarily more extreme in the military than it is anywhere else, which might be insinuated or thought in some quarters. The second point I would say is that at the top level, in terms of the policy level, and which is kind of where I am and in government and senior military, the awareness of it is really clear, well understood. The fact that General Nucci, for example, was appointed as the czar of it within defence tells you that about the seriousness with which it's taken. And and I've sat on executive committees of our army board. I've sat on the executive, all of those, the most senior boards, the army board with the defence secretary and others, where this has been discussed as an issue. So it is at the very top level, it is taken very seriously. Right down at the bottom, the women and men in the army have to go and, sorry, can you hear me? The women and men in the army have to go and deal with the consequences of this. Either it's very hot, it's very cold, it's very windy, it's very wet. So they're very aware of it. And I'm certainly not saying that there isn't climate change denial in there. And as to our response to it, and there was a question, I think, about dependence on fossil fuels and so forth, which clearly has been a big national political topic at the moment regards Ukraine and Russian energy supplies and so forth. And there is, we're clear on our core purpose, and we need to be ready to fight. And it takes time to develop these technologies and capabilities. And in the meantime, we possess a lot of legacy systems which don't do what we know where we need to get to in the future. But that actually increases our determination to get on and deliver some of this transformational technology, to get ahead of the game. We're always trying to stay ahead of would-be adversaries. And we see, as I said in my remarks before, a real synergy between our efforts to deal with climate change and becoming more lethal, agile, and expeditionary on the battlefield. Oh, and sorry, there is one other point actually, which I'd just like to raise, which is to go back to something Laurie said in his opening remarks about the fact that in terms of recruiting in the army, we're recruiting a different type of person, partly because of the new way in which we're fighting and operating, but partly because people care about this. The young people that we're seeking to attract, not all of them, but a lot of them, and especially those who are sort of more technically able and so forth, really care about this. So we're very conscious that we need to appeal to that side of people's motivations.
Thank you for that. And to move on to another question that's come through, it looks at the raises the point of inter-service variations on how we're addressing climate change. So are you noticing in your individual fields, Brigadier John mentioned that potentially the impacts of climate insecurity may be felt slightly more from a land component piece. But I wondered if there are different perceptions that you're noticing within different services about the implications of climate change, and whether you feel there's a risk that it's taken more seriously in some services rather than others. Potentially, I don't know if maybe Duraid or Andrea want to fill this first, coming from a teaching perspective across defence might be a good starting point. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I would say, and I completely agree with what Brigadier Clark said about, the military being representative of sort of wider society. And I think we're seeing, in our students, that same groundswell of, desire to know more about these issues and concern surrounding these issues. And I would say that does broadly fall across all services within the UK educational context. There is a consistent desire to know more about these issues across the different services. Certainly, there may be a potentially more of a focus on, from an RAF perspective at the minute, due to some of sort of Air Chief Marshal Wigston's, the 2040 target, and due to the status of the RAF as a kind of a major emitter within the services. And, obviously that's replicated across different military forces. The air component as a major emitter. But I think in general, we're seeing, a broadly similar level of concern regarding the security implications of these issues, as well as genuinely quite a significant focus on the potential for mitigation across different services and how that can be, feasibly achieved, and what might be the offsets and the challenges of achieving that. But I haven't specifically seen, variation in as much. What we have seen as part of that groundswell, certainly we're seeing officers come through now that quite consistently reference the idea of not just that these are challenges that they will need to address once they reach, positions of higher command, but also thinking about it from future generations' perspectives and their children and so forth. So within the education environment, I think you move to a certain extent beyond that service culture and into that kind of more human perspective. I'll throw over to Andrea.
Thanks, Duraid. I think we see something similar. We have now published our Air Force strategy on climate, our Navy climate plan, and our Army one, it's not necessarily, we've done a really good job of pulling out the best things from each of them. For example, we had the Army climate adaptation tool, which is now our defense climate adaptation tool. So we picked that up as something really well developed within the Army, and now are applying it across the force. The Air Force has some of our best weather, and they're really developing some of our predictive climate and analytics for the whole force. So we have twofold. We have best practices within each service that we can elevate to the joint level. And then I don't see a hurdle with how each service is approaching it. I mean, it's very different for a Navy ship at sea to experience climate change than it is for a Humvee in the middle of the desert. So I think it's highly appropriate that each service is giving due thought to how it's going to affect their individual warfighting battle space.
Thank you, Andrea. I don't know if the other two panelists have any additions on that, or we can move on to another question.
I would just say briefly, Tristan, that just to pick up on Andrea's last point, we work closely with the other services, and I know James has been talking as well to make sure that what we're doing is complementary in one way or the other. I mean, the point is that the Royal Air Force, as Duraid said, are responsible for quite a lot of the emissions just by dint of the way they get to work. In the Army's case, most of it comes from our estate, and I explain what we're trying to do about that. But the point is, it's not just about threats, and there are opportunities, and particularly when you look from the Royal Navy's perspective, I guess, or navies around the world, actually the effects of climate change are making parts of the world much more accessible to them, and I'm thinking particularly up in the high north, and therefore that arguably poses opportunity and threat in that environment. So dealing with the consequences of it in that way as well.
And Tris, could I just come in and say that I think one of the things we noticed in the study that I mentioned earlier was that the leadership climate across different branches, particularly embodied in a values basis to leadership, is an important thing that in an armed forces context can be extended to incorporate concerns of, say, younger generations about the environment being a core part of what they see as their values in the workplace. I think there are lessons to be learned there in more of a civilian context as well. We have to develop that same kind of values basis to leadership, and I don't think we've got political leaders in particular are kind of groping towards how they can embody that in a lot of government institutions and in how policy making is made. So I think it's that kind of leadership climate that we see across the armed forces. It does give actually a kind of comparative advantage when it comes to how you can work with the workforce in responding to, well, ensuring ecological security globally, ultimately.
Okay, thank you. We've got a minute left, so I think in terms of adhering to the time, I will wrap up now, as opposed to eating into the break prior to the final panel conversation, which is going to start at 1500. So that just leaves me with enough time to thank again all of the 4 panelists that joined us for this conversation and debate. Thank you for your time and for preparing such great thought-provoking presentations. And I will leave it now to the break until 1500 for panel 4. Thank you very much.